Another part of Domain 1, Security and Risk Management, is what we call a complete and effective security program, right? Which means that we need to incorporate all of the different business units within our organization to complete this overall security program, okay? So what does that involve? Well, number one, it's going to involve an oversight committee, right? Oversight committees have personnel from lots of different business units. And again, this goes back to our CCB discussion before. The whole point of this is to bring together people that are going to have different perspectives on what's important in the organization. HR department, the legal department, and the IT department, you cannot, obviously we know that those three departments are not going to have the same perspective on security, right? Obviously code of conduct, employment and labor regulations, termination regulations, disciplinary policies, that's very important to the HR department. The server administrator could care less about that stuff, right? They're going to be, the IT folks are going to be providing input on the technical controls that need to be implemented, but code of conduct can be regulated by those technical controls. Labor relations, employee interaction, termination of employees, that's going to involve the IT department because you have to offboard those employees that get terminated. And then, of course, the lawyers. The lawyers are always involved, right? They need to make sure that the language of the policies protect the organization. They include the intent. Local, state, and federal laws need to be applicable and followed by these different organizations. So compliance based on ethics, contractual obligations, and investigations that lead to policy creation. All right? This probably is the one that's the most difficult to ensure, compliance based on ethics. We're going to make you do this because, well, it's just what you're supposed to do. It's the best thing to do. You're not supposed to, sexually harass your coworkers. There's legality to that, but there's also a point of ethics, right? There's always these gray areas in business operations that I didn't really know I was supposed to do that or not. George Costanza on Seinfeld, a perfect example. He was having sexual relations with the cleaning staff in the office, and he goes in, his boss finds out, and he goes into the office and he goes, oh, I didn't realize that was frowned upon. You know, it wasn't written in my policy that I wasn't supposed to do that. Well, yeah, okay. It may not be written, but you pretty much should have a good understanding that that's not something you're supposed to do. It's not really ethical, okay? Of course, contractual obligations, that's more related to the legal department, and that's less of a gray area and more of a black and white area because contracts are contracts. Of course, they're only as good as the verbiage that is written in the contract, but and then investigations that lead to policy creation. That might be something that falls under HR, right? Maybe they identify some issues with labor laws being violated or whatever, and so they're going to change the policy or implement some sort of policy to effectively meet that requirement. Oversight committees are comprised of management level employees, not always technical employees. Management level employees primarily because a lot of decisions have to be made, right? And usually the managers are the ones that are making those decisions. There's no direct relationship between an oversight committee and the security department. Remember, the security department is really responsible for making sure that the controls get implemented. Oversight committee is really just a governing body. It's a group of individuals that, again, have that kind of high-level perspective. The value of the committee is to provide business direction and increased awareness of security activities impacting the organization. Okay? Very much like what we talked about before with an information security professional. Mission statements and vision are really important as well. The Security Council vision statement is identified as kind of a reference to security concepts, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Again, this is not from the perspective of business operations or the business as a whole. This is from the perspective of security. It should be worthwhile, it should be brief, high level, and to the point, and achievable. Okay? Vision statements are a lot different than mission statements in general. Vision is more of a big picture. A mission is kind of a roadmap for achieving that vision. So we can kind of think of the vision statement as kind of the strategy, whereas the mission statement is the technical component. But so we have objectives that support our overall vision, a roadmap to achieving that vision. The primary concern of a mission statement is to communicate the goals to our technical and non-technical personnel. So maybe your mission as a business is to support low-income families, or some I can't say that word, philanthropic venture, right? I think that's the right way to say it. I'm not sure. But your vision is kind of more general. We are here to do good, right? The mission is how you might implement that. Okay? Not so important for the test, but something that we distinguish. There always has to be some sort of oversight to your security program. You need to make sure that there are checks and balances in the program, meaning that not only do you have to define your policies and implement those policies, there has to be a way of verifying that the policies are being effective. So this is going to provide members of the council input, influence, direction of a security program. Hey, we implemented this acceptable use policy and nobody's following it. Okay, well, why aren't they following it? Because it's too restrictive, because it's too technical, because people aren't reading it, because they're not trained on it, whatever it might be. We decide on project initiatives, which reduces business risk through the controls that we implement, whether they're technical, physical, or administrative, and we understand those initiatives and the resulting business impact. Same thing we've been talking about over and over again. Mitigate risk through controls, understand the controls that we're actually going to implement, and what is the impact of them implementing those controls on the business. Hopefully it's a positive impact, providing additional security without affecting the overall operation of the business. Prioritize information security efforts. Understand project initiatives and impact, and prioritize the projects. Very important concept, because you may have a whole list of objectives that you're trying to achieve, which basically is those are the objectives, the mission that you're implementing to achieve your vision, right? To go back to what we talked about in the previous slide. Well, you can't implement all those objectives in parallel. In fact, some objectives might actually have to be implemented before other objectives can be implemented. So you have to prioritize those projects. Okay? Review and recommend security policies to include a line-by-line review of your policies, a general review of the standards, a cursory review of the procedures to support those policies, and then some sort of monitoring program of the implementation plan to make sure that you're meeting the policies, the standards, and the baseline requirements that you identified. Okay? This is a subset of everything that we talked about previously, those building blocks of generating these security policies. Reviews and audit of the security program. So now we're moving into, after we've implemented the program, now we need to continually monitor the program and make sure it's still meeting the objectives. Auditors provide an independent review of the design, the effectiveness, and the implementation of your controls, administrative, technical, and physical. Audits result in findings requiring management response and corrective actions to action plans to mitigate your risk. Meaning what? Right? By the way, audits are generally performed by third parties, right? Now, that third party might be a different business unit within your organization, or it could be an actual physical third party. Why is that important? That a third party is involved? Because they have a different perspective, right? It's always interesting. I mean, this happens in life all the time. It's like people go to counselors because I have my perspective on why I'm getting in an argument with my girlfriend or wife or whatever. She has her perspective, and we're never going to convince each other otherwise, right? But a third party might see something that we both don't see, right? That's a stretch from what we're talking about, but you get the idea. An auditor doesn't have skin in the game necessarily. So they're not necessarily concerned about the bottom line of the business. They're not concerned about making the security personnel look good. They're concerned about whether or not you meet policy. So that's always a good thing, okay? Program Oversight champion organizational security efforts. A council needs to understand and accept policy, and then committees champions to the policy. What does that term mean? We see that term a lot in business. They're a champion of this or a champion of that. What does it really mean? Doesn't mean they're a stakeholder. Doesn't mean that they're a technical implementer. It means that they're a supporter, right? Anybody that, a champion of thinQtank would be somebody going out and promoting the business and promoting the organization and really acting as an ambassador to that organization. Well, a champion of a policy is the same thing, right? Champions would be people in influential positions convincing people in less influential positions that this is a good thing. It's kind of important. It's kind of the politics of this whole concept. I always talk about the OSI model when I'm teaching network classes, and 7-layer model. You guys probably know that, having gone through my classes before, but I always say it's 9 layers because budget and politics always sit at the top, right? Well, politics is a big deal, right? It is a big deal, okay? Recommended areas requiring investment. Members provide input based on their business units to promote board support for projects. We need the money, show me the money, right? Establishes budgetary understanding of managers and CFO. We need to be able to convince the higher-ups that actually write the checks that those checks need to be written to meet our goals. Pretty straightforward. Okay? Frameworks. Control frameworks are very important. Now, I will slow down a little bit here because one of the things that's covered on the exam quite a bit are these frameworks. And you will have to know the different standards bodies and different frameworks. So we're going to take a look at a few of those throughout the rest of this lesson here. The whole point of a framework, it's not specific to technology. It's not specific to procedure or policy. Framework, by definition, is it's the support structure. It's the general guidelines, the general concepts that drive decisions. All right? Now, the benefit of having a framework for a specific business sector or a business unit or a type of business is that, well, these are all the bullet points that kind of define the benefit of a framework. Number one, it's consistent, right? Policies are consistent across different businesses that fall within the same business realm or business organization. So security and privacy policies have to be consistent so that we always have the same outcome for the same security situation that businesses that operate in the same space will see. It's measurable, meaning that we have to have a way of determining the progress of our security policy, set the goals, and the control framework itself includes an assessment standard. Basically, we're trying to identify metrics. We're trying to identify measurable points to measure whether or not the security policy is effective. Frameworks are standardized. Control framework relies on standardization for expected results. That's kind of related to consistency, but it's actually related to measurability as well. And then it's comprehensive. It's going to cover regulatory requirements, legal requirements, etc., and it's also modular, meaning that you can apply components of that framework based on your business as an individual entity. Not all business, some businesses might, certain hospitals fall under, well, here's an example. All hospitals fall under compliance regulations for HIPAA, but an emergency room or a Trauma One center might have to implement a lot more controls in a framework than, say, an urgent care center, because of the type of procedures they're doing, because of the type of patients they're seeing and stuff, things like that. So this modularity is very important because you don't have to implement the whole framework. You can implement pieces of the framework. All right? So here's the first one. NIST, right? National Institute of Standards and Technology. Probably heard of those guys, right? They have lots of different publications, but 853R4 is a control framework. There are 285 controls and 19 families within this framework. We're not going to go through all of them, I promise you. Okay? But most federal agencies, most government contractors, they fall under this framework. Now, that's the extent of what you need to know for the test, right? They're not going to ask you what the IR, what class IR falls under, or what family it falls under, or RA, and so on. And we're not going to go through all that. I put the chart on there just to give you an example. Those are the 19 different families that you see, AC, AT, AU, CA, etc. And then the class, is it a technical control? Is it an operational control? Is it a physical control? We don't see any physical ones, so we see a management on there, right? But it makes sense. You look at this chart now, you understand the difference between an operational control, a technical control, and a management control. All right? That's what the class represents. So we don't go to the 285 different controls, but the 19 different families you can see here. All right? You're not going to be tested on those individual families, but they make sense, right? You look at access control. Well, that's clearly technical, right? Now, we might classify access control under physical as well. Putting a gate in front of a building, that's kind of considered as physical access control. So we don't get into the granularity in this particular publication, but you get the idea. That's one example. We also see kind of comparisons between different controls. Here we're seeing a representation of ISO 27001 2013, which we have a control framework here, right? Now, this is just a snippet of that framework. Again, it's much, much more detailed than what we would typically see. Well, we can't go through every aspect of it. But what do we see here? We see the category, in this particular case, asset management. Data, personnel, devices, systems, facilities that enable the organization to achieve their business purpose and identified and managed consistent with their relative importance to business objectives and organizational risk strategy. Okay, a lot of information there, but it all makes sense. And then we have physical devices and systems within the organization. We have software platforms and applications. We have organizational communications and data flows, and external information systems, etc. So these are just different subcategories of asset management. And then we have essentially the control, right? Technology it's related to, and then information, informative references. These are all other standards and publications that relate to this ISO standard. So the ISO 27001 is kind of a comprehensive certification. That means that you meet all of these different standards. And again, I'm not going to get into the details specifically. All right? There's extension of asset management as well. All right? They're not going to test you on this kind of stuff. They're not even going to test you on Category 5 or Category 6 or Category 1 or Category 2, Category 3. Those aren't the types of questions you would expect to see on a CISSP. Why is this even being brought up then? Well, because you need to understand what the definition of a framework is and how frameworks are comprised, right? And by the way, if you're an IA professional, you may be directed by this framework. You know, the stakeholders or the board of directors or somebody might tell you, we have to be ISO compliant, specifically ISO 27001. Well, guess what? Now you have to become an expert in that. That's when you have to start to drill down and identify what that compliance restriction is. And by the way, that's not typically an individual. That's a team of individuals that are involved in that. ISO compliance is a very difficult thing to achieve, right? There's ISO compliance for manufacturing, for support, for security, and depending on the organization, will depend on what you essentially go after. Now, one of the terms that you definitely have to be aware of is due care versus due diligence. You will be tested on this for sure. So we need to define the difference between due care and due diligence. Okay? Care a reasonable person would use under given circumstances. Describes the organization's legal duty. Lack of due care is negligence and actionable under law. Okay? I have to admit, although I probably shouldn't admit it, I love watching people's court. I don't know why. I guess it's because it's something I can just turn on the TV and listen to. I don't have to watch it. I can work on other stuff. Well, but you know, it's always interesting. I always try to predict the outcome of the case before all the evidence is presented. But in almost every case, in that particular show anyway, somebody is suing somebody for either breach of contract or you know, some accident that occurred. And one of the things that comes up is just because damages occurred doesn't mean you're responsible for those damages. If you acted with due care and something occurred, maybe it's just an accident. So you don't get pain and suffering. You don't get all these extra damages because I wasn't negligent necessarily, right? Yes, an accident occurred, but I wasn't negligent. An example would be the girl that's driving down the highway loses control of the car and crashes and her sister gets killed. Does she get charged with manslaughter? Well, if it was an accident, no. But if she's on her cell phone texting or Snapchatting or recording a video and speeding and not paying attention, that's what happens. Then you get, because you didn't act, you were negligent. You didn't act with due care. Right? That's an example that actually happened, by the way. I don't know if you guys remember that story. The girl that filmed her sister dead on the street, but pretty gruesome thing. Driving down the highway, Snapchatting, seeing videos, whatever, loses control of the car flips over, the sister in the back's not wearing a seatbelt, gets sent out of the car, the head hits the ground and splits open, and she's videotaping the whole thing and saying, I just killed my sister, blah, blah, blah. Did you hear that story? I did not hear it. Yeah. Yeah, it was pretty rough. She was drunk and everything else. So how is due care different than due diligence? Due care is the act, what you do at the moment, right? That guy putting his tie in there, saying, "Hey, check this out." That's not due care. It's not the way that machine was supposed to be used, right? Yeah, it's funny and whatever, but it's not. It's negligent, right? Due diligence is more of a proactive approach, right? Meaning that we're doing preemptive measures. Due diligence is what leads to due care. Does that make sense? So putting up barriers for an alligator pit, like Disney, right? Putting up barriers and signs, that's due diligence. That's why Disney didn't get sued for that kid getting eaten by the alligator, because they did everything they could to prevent people from going into the water. Maybe.
It's well marked.
It's well marked.
It is well marked.
Yeah. So the negligence then falls on the guest, not on the park, right? Now, had they not done their due diligence and not posted signs and not done any, then all of a sudden there is no measure of whether the person acted in due care, right? Background checks of employees, makes sense. Credit checks of business partners. Information system security assessments, risk assessment, penetration testing of firewalls, contingency testing, threat intelligence and services to check for company intellectual property on the internet. These are all due diligence, right? You understand the difference, right, between due care and due diligence, because you're going to have to know that for the exam, okay? From an information security standpoint, if you don't provide individuals the tools to act with due care, then you could be negligent as an organization, right? But you're trying to shift the responsibility of due care to the individuals accessing the resources. Putting a banner on a router when you log into a router is due diligence. Due care would be then somebody saying, well, I saw the banner and I ignored it. And I broke into the system anyway. That was not acting in due care, okay? Information security due diligence framed to manage risk to business missions and functions, right? We implement these controls based on our business. If I'm going to have an individual driving children to school, a school bus, I want to make sure that they have a good driving record, that they don't have a history of violating driving laws, right? That would be due diligence. Now, I might not be concerned about that if I'm an IT organization and I don't have to have drivers. Execute due diligence in regard to information security and risk management. Use risk management tools and techniques in developing, implementing, maintaining safeguards and countermeasures to address threats to operations, assets, and individuals. We're going to learn all about risk management tools after lunch. The goal is to ensure systems and organizations have resilience for responsibilities, critical applications, and continuity. Make sense? All right. So we are wrapped up with that. The next lesson, or the next chapter, will go into compliance, and then we'll get into some risk assessment. All right.